Hi, are you here for the satanic sacrifice?
Yes, my name is Dave Collins.
Let me just look at the list here. Okay, yep, Dave Collins. And how do you know the Dark Priest?
We went to college together.
Oh, okay, well that's great. Well, just take a seat up there in the 4th row. Hail Satan.
Hail Satan.
Hail Satan. Hi, are you here for the satanic sacrifice?
Yes.
And what's your name?
John Lennon.
Lennon. I've got a Vladimir Lenin. Is it spelled Lenin?
No, Lennon.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not seeing a John Lennon here under the Dark Lord's guest list. If you would just step aside one moment, we have another person coming. Hi, are you here for the satanic sacrifice? Yeah, I'm here. Name's Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger, there we are. Okay, yep, right up in the front. Someone likes you, Mick. Hail Satan. Hail Satan. Oh, sorry, sir. I just can't find you on this list.
I'm John Lennon. You don't... I've done plenty of dark things. Battery. I can't imagine why I'm not on this list.
Yes, I'm sorry, but domestic violence, it doesn't fall under the category as do as thou will. I'm sorry, please step aside. Hi, are you here for the satanic sacrifice? Yeah, my name's John Denver. John Denver. Oh, you get to be on stage. Okay, go right on in. Hail Satan. Hail Satan.
John Denver's going in.
Oh, so I'm so sorry. I feel so awful. You know, I'll tell you what. We actually do have an overflow room in the Hall of Disgrace right next door. We have a live feed that will be feeding it into screens there. I can happily take you over there where you can watch the proceedings.
All right, I suppose that'll do.
Okay, I'll be happy to take you to the Hall of Disgrace in just one moment. We have a few more guests. Hi, how are you? Okay, Mr. Bigfoot. Yep, there you are on the list. Okay, just take a seat in aisle 5 next to the Loch Ness Monster. Okay, and yes, you?
I'm Shirley Temple.
Oh, Shirley Temple. Oh, yep, there you are. And how do you know the Dark Lord?
We did a musical together.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, okay. Yep. There you are. Aisle 7, please.
Thank you.
Hail Satan.
Hail Satan. Animal sacrifices in my soup.
Oh, okay. Everybody in. You know what? Sir, Mr. Lennon, you know what? There's actually some standing room right here in the back if you want to slip in right here.
All right. Thank you.
Enjoy the ritual.
Hail Satan.
Hail Satan.
Imagine all the screeching.
Welcome. I want all rise. Friends, family, absolute fucking heathens. Thank you for joining me today in this sacrifice of this unwilling victim that we have gagged and bound up here in the front. Yes, that's right. Let us all begin with a prayer. Please throw up the horns to the Dark Lord as we say, Dark Lord, thank you for providing all this fellowship for us today, especially this unwilling sacrifice that lays gagged and bound before us. And I want to also personally thank Mr. Diddy, Mr. Puff Diddy Daddy, for catering the event and for throwing the party afterwards. We're all looking forward to it. Can't wait to see a lot of you in Vaseline and baby oil. All right, let's get this show on the road. Hail Satan! Hail Satan! Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
And you have arrived at the Creep Street Podcast. Everyone gather in, get inside. Come on, everybody, get in, gather in. Because we are continuing our journey through rock and roll history. That's right. Today it is Volume 2 of Rock and Roll in the Occult. Beatles are stones. Oh, yes. Let's slide back to a different era now. Let's slide back into 1967. In fact, it was June 1st, 1967, when the world's biggest band at the time dropped what was going to become one of the most iconic records of all time. The Beatles, which by 67 were already legendary, released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an LP that became a cultural touchstone for the free-spirited summer of love. But this wasn't just an album, folks. This was a statement. It was a musical journey that gave listeners a taste of the psychedelic experience. And it wasn't just the music that left people buzzing. The album cover itself was an enigma, a visual feast that invited fans to study and theorize and obsess over the same way people might watch a trailer over and over to look for Easter eggs today. It was kind of like that. It really, honestly, if you think about it, I mean, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, I had never really thought about it till a few years ago when looking at it, like the sort of Dadaist almost style of art, the almost like it's cut out of magazines in a way.
It's got an almost collage look to it.
It does. It's not straight collage, but it has this collage like aspect to it, which I guess is part of that Dadaist. It reminds me of Terry Gilliam. He did like the art for those old like Monty Python sketches. When you look at this album cover, I mean, it really is pretty fascinating, and it says a lot on its own. Among those featured on the album cover were some unconventional personalities, but there's one in particular that stands out. A figure whose fame was as infamous as it was unsettling. And tracks like With a Little Help from My Friends and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life became instant classics. Even decades later, fans and critics alike would look back at this album as a defining moment in rock history, a work that showcased groundbreaking recording techniques and the Beatles' unparalleled artistry. So this cover was shot by a photographer named Michael Cooper on March 30th of 1967, and like we said, this was no ordinary photo shoot. This was something totally different. Up until then, album covers were pretty straightforward. You know, the band poses, you snap the photo, you call it a day. In fact, Gage, one of the best insults I ever heard someone say it was you, this was years ago, you might not even remember it, but I remember you said, we were joking about something and you said, you're the kind of guy who'd smile on an album cover. And I thought, that is true. When you think about it, only like kind of the goofiest bastards actually smile on an album cover. Like most of the coolest like album covers, if the artists are on the album, they're typically not just like cheesing it.
Right.
Unless it's like early 60s and back, people don't really smile on their album covers. You know, it's kind of uncool really, unless you're like Kenny G or some shit, you know?
Right. Or Slim Whitman.
There you go. But the Beatles, they weren't interested in playing by the rules, oh no. They wanted something that would redefine how their music was presented visually. So that's where a man named Peter Blake comes in. At the time, Blake was a rising star in London's pop art scene, and he had a vision for this album cover. He later recalled that it wasn't just him making decisions, this was literally a collaboration. He worked closely with the Beatles and with Robert Fraser, a trendy and eccentric art gallery owner, and together the group came up with an idea that broke the mold. It was a life-size collage featuring a mix of real people, photographs, and artwork. Blake described it as creating a, quote, magical ideal film, a kind of fantasy gathering where history and pop culture and all these political figures all collided in one framework. Like, where else are you going to see Bob Dylan with Aleister Crowley, the man we're going to be talking about a bit here soon? I mean, think about it. It's a very eclectic gathering of people on the album cover. Some people that weren't even alive at the same time as each other, you know? It's sort of a fanfic in a way. So, Blake, Fraser, and the four Beatles, they sat down to make a list of who they wanted on this cover. And the wish list of people they had in mind was pretty wild. According to Blake, the final product was a mashup of 6 different sets of characters, each reflecting the unique personalities and influences of the contributor. So who made the cut for this surreal album party? Well, there's some of the obvious picks. There were contemporaries of the Beatles that they admired, of course, Bob Dylan and Terry Southern. Then you had Hollywood folks like Fred Astaire, Laurel and Hardy, Tony Curtis, Marlon Brando, and of course, the everlasting, the immortal Marilyn Monroe. But it wasn't just about movie stars and rock stars. This group also included a parade of artistic and literary rebels, such as Edgar Allan Poe, the American master of the macabre, whose death is still pretty much a mystery to this day. In fact, that would make for a great Creep Street episode, is the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. William S. Burroughs, a counterculture legend. Aubrey Beardsley, and a controversial illustrator. Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet, in fact, maybe my favorite poet. And Oscar Wilde, the provocateur and playwright and author. But here's where things take a darker turn. If you shift your gaze to the top left corner of the cover, nestled in between the serene face of the Indian yogi Sri Yukteswar Giri and the sultry smirk of 1930s sex symbol Mae West, you'll find a face that is rather unsettling. A glowering, bald-headed visage of a man who was once dubbed the wickedest man in the world, and his name was Aleister Crowley. Now, Crowley is someone who's is definitely going to get their own episode in the future. It's someone who's come up a lot on Creep Street. Whenever we do cover the life of Aleister Crowley, it will definitely be a multiple-part episode because the man, he kind of pops up everywhere. He's kind of like shadow people in that in almost every paranormal instance, there's instances of shadow people, whether it's a poltergeist tale or a possession tale. Usually shadow people will pop up. Aleister Crowley pops up in so much occult history, you almost can't get rid of him. He's always there in the background. Crowley was not just some random inclusion into this album cover. This was a man whose reputation was steeped in the occult. In a lot of ways, he became the face of the occult. A self-proclaimed magician who dabbled in the dark arts and lived by an infamous creed, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." To some, he was a genius, and to others, a dangerous madman. So, what was he doing on the cover of a Beatles album? What did his presence mean? Did it mean something deeper, or was it just a cheeky little nod to the counterculture's fascination with all things taboo? Well, whatever the case, his inclusion added an eerie layer to an otherwise colorful and whimsical collage. Crowley's piercing gaze seemed to challenge viewers, daring them to look beyond just the music and see the strange and shadowy forces woven into the psychedelic era. So yeah, this guy, very fascinating. When it comes to the inclusion of Aleister Crowley on Sgt. Pepper's cover, the most sources point to Paul McCartney as the Beatle responsible for picking him. While McCartney may have tossed Crowley's name into the mix, it's likely that his knowledge of the man's life and work was surface level at best, according to my sources. In fact, if you look at McCartney's later career and personal philosophies, there's really no trace of Crowley's teachings and foundation that he built. So why in 1967 did they choose to spotlight the infamous figure? Well, here's the thing. Paul McCartney was plugged in. He was deeply attuned to trends and vibes that were going on in young Britain and America in the burgeoning counterculture of the 60s. This was a time when taboo figures and controversial ideas were being dusted off and reevaluated, and Crowley, with his scandalous reputation and provocative philosophies, was prime material for this cultural revival. But McCartney wasn't alone in shaping the cover. Peter Blake, the artist who helped bring the Sgt. Pepper cover to life, he had his own specialty, found imagery. He loved digging up old advertising and illustrations and then repurposing them with a dose of irony and wit. So literally kind of like Dadaist art in a way. Together, McCartney and Blake tapped into a growing fascination with Victoriana, the ornate and theatrical style of the late 19th century. So like the Victorian era and all the trappings that came with that. You can see it all over the album cover. From the brightly colored uniforms of the pepper bandsmen to the carnival aesthetic of being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, and Aleister Crowley, born in 1875, Crowley fit neatly into this Victoriana revival. Blake chose a photo of Crowley taken by Hector Murchison in 1913. It's a stark and haunting image that would become Crowley's most famous portrait, thanks to its placement on the Sgt. Pepper cover. But there's more. Crowley wasn't the only controversial figure that the Beatles had wanted on the cover. Originally, the list also included names like Adolf Hitler, the Marquis de Sade, and even Mahatma Gandhi, choices that were ultimately cut, likely to avoid stirring up too much trouble. Crowley, though, made the cut, alongside other figures like Oscar Wilde and the surrealist Lewis Carroll, and even the decadent artist Aubrey Beardsley. But by the 1960s, the world was rethinking these figures. Where once they'd been vilified as threats to moral decency, now they were being re-examined as maybe misunderstood geniuses, martyrs to a world that feared their brilliance. Crowley, the man once dubbed the wickedest man in the world, was no longer seen as an affront to British sensibilities, but a victim of society's own hypocrisy. So while Crowley's face may have just been one of many on the Sgt. Pepper album, its inclusion carried a lot of weight, a nod to the counterculture's embrace of rebellion and eccentricity and shadowy figures. It wasn't just art, it was a statement, as we said. So, here's a little bit about Crowley. So Edward Alexander Crowley, better known as Aleister Crowley, the self-proclaimed Great Beast, was born into a brewing fortune on October 12, 1875, in a household more pious than even the strictest of churches. Thus, Crowley was set up for a life less ordinary. With a silver spoon in his mouth and rebellion in his heart, he was educated at Cambridge, traveled the globe, and indulged in nearly every vice available to a man of his standing, from intoxicants to the pleasures of the flesh. In fact, Crowley lived very openly as a bisexual man, which at the time, that was not looked on kindly, obviously. Not just any rich rebel, Crowley embraced the dark, pushing boundaries and diving deep into the occult, a path that would mark him as an outsider to this very day. He was dubbed by his very own horrified mother as, quote, the Great Beast, and he turned this moniker into a badge of honor, weaving it into the very fabric of his personality. His life was a canvas of contradictions. Brilliant yet abrasive, charismatic yet controversial, he mingled with the likes of famed novelist Somerset Maugham in Paris, who found him both repulsive and fascinating, a character so vivid that he inspired the sinister protagonist of Maugham's novel The Magician. Crowley's tales were a mix of truth and embellishment, like most great legends, crafting a persona that was as much a performance as any of his ritualistic endeavors, which is true, kind of like Robert Johnson, someone who we aren't really sure how much is legend and what's actually real about him. Crowley, even though he is much more documented because he actually wrote many novels, and there's a reason why we don't know much about Johnson. All we have of him is a few photographs, the 29 songs he recorded, and then, the bits of knowledge we got from people who knew him. Crowley, despite being a well-known figure, much about him, it's kind of unknown. It's kind of hard to tell what's real and what isn't to this very day, which is kind of interesting. But it just shows you how some of these great legends, they mix. Fantasy and fiction mix. There's a little bit of truth and a little bit of fiction in with everything, and it kind of enhances the legend of these folks. So Crowley's journey into the occult wasn't a mere flirtation with the mysterious, but a full-blown love affair. Something that we will touch back on later is Crowley's notorious stint at Boleskine House, which sat ominously on the southern shores of the famous Loch Ness. This wasn't just any home, this was Crowley's castle of the occult. In 1899, Crowley sought a secluded sanctuary where he could perform one of the most complex rituals known to the dark arts, the Abramelin operation. According to themystica.com, the Abramelin operation is a ritual steeped in shadows and forbidden esoteric knowledge. It originated from the eerie passages of a 15th century grimoire, a book called the Book of Abramelin. This arcane practice promised the practitioner the, quote, knowledge and conversation with one's holy guardian angel. So imagine, my friends, conversing with your celestial guide, a beacon of your deepest spiritual self. But embarking on this journey was not for the faint of heart. It demanded a grueling 6 to 18 months of preparation, a test of will where only the most devoted dare tread. The practitioner's days must be filled with strict prayer, meditation, and fasting. So this was no weekend hobby, but a full-time commitment to spiritual ascension. As the ritual deepens, so does its complexity. Picture this. The air is thick with the scent of incense, a lone figure surrounded by meticulously drawn magical squares, reciting ancient prayers as the clock ticks towards the witching hour. The true aim, to stand face to face with one's own guardian angel, a spiritual summit few would reach, where one gains mastery over demonic forces, bending them to the will of the magician. It's said that Aleister Crowley, the infamous magician, dabbled deeply with this and even incorporated it into his thelemic magic, thelema being the religion that he would go on to create, and transformed it and adopted its essence to suit his bold vision. So in the world of esoteric endeavors, the Abramelin operation is not just a ritual. This is a serious rite of passage, only for those brave enough to peer into the abyss and to challenge the other side. Because what might emerge might be divine or infernal. But as with many of Crowley's ventures, things did not go as planned. The ritual, which demanded rigorous precision and half a year of dedication, at least, was never completed. He never completed the ritual. And according to some sources, they say that quitting the ritual without completing it makes one prey of demonic forces. Essentially, you forfeit your soul to the infernal, essentially. The reasons remain shrouded in mystery as to why he just quit the ritual one day. Some say it was a break that was needed by his duties in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and others had rumors of darker disruptions. But the result? The house to this day is said to be haunted by malevolent spirits that were unleashed and unbound during the performance of this ritual. Boleskine House became more than just a home. It became a nexus of the paranormal and a stark reminder of Crowley's flirtations with the forces from beyond the veil. In fact, some say that his dabbling with the arcane there at Boleskine Manor may have been what opened a possible rift and allowed the famous monster of Loch Ness to come through. So some think that the Loch Ness Monster may have actually been brought about by Aleister Crowley's playing around with this naughty ritual.
Good job.
I mean, hey, tell Mom we got a dinosaur in the lake.
God damn it. Alistair's been doing that ritual shit again. We got some fucking monster in the lake.
Al, get your ass inside.
Yeah.
So Crowley would eventually go on to break away from the Order of the Golden Dawn, forming his own Order of the Silver Star, which just seems like you downgraded from gold to silver.
Order of Second Place.
Order of Second Place, yeah. Congratulations. Congratulations.
Why would you choose that?
I know, after Golden Dawn, the Silver Star? Come on. So, this is what drove him to write his magnum opus, the Book of the Law, where he made his very famous quote, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." His life became a saga of highs and lows, from forming a commune in Sicily to being vilified by the press as the wickedest man in the world. Despite his infamy and decline into drug addiction and poverty, Crowley's philosophical and magical writings continued to attract followers, cementing his status as a prophet of a new age of enlightenment, or chaos, depending on whom you ask. And like I said, he was the creator of the faith known as Thelema, which we will save for the dedicated Crowley episode, which is long overdue. Interesting fact, though, before we continue on, Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, was actually at one time a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn. So now, back to those four lads from Liverpool. By the time the summer of love rolled around, Crowley's infamous mantra, "Do what thou wilt," had struck a chord with the youth of the day. To the Beatles and their army of listeners around the world, for them, Crowley wasn't just some wicked, diabolical asshole from a bygone era. To young folks in the late 60s, he was a visionary, a man ahead of his time. You see, Crowley embodied the rebellion of the 60s as he led a life that embraced the rejection of the old, dusty ideals of duty and restraint and just mere blind obedience. For a generation that was fed up with authority's shallow expectations, Crowley offered something much more radical, a call to follow their own deepest and truest desires without apology. It wasn't just about indulgence for indulgence sake, it was about liberation. So in many ways, do as thou wilt, it's not a bad thing as in do what you want. Also, from what I understand, Thelema did preach do as thou wilt, essentially, as long as it doesn't directly harm anyone. But yeah, it was all about indulging all of your deepest, darkest fantasies, as long as everyone's a willing participant and of age and, all that stuff. So Crowley's philosophy, rooted in the concept of thelema, which was the Greek word for will, gave a spiritual weight to what many saw as the defining trio of 60s culture: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. For Crowley, these weren't just distractions or vices, they were sacred acts, a way to connect with your true self and to break free from the chains of societal conformity. In fact, he was very well known for what is called sex magic, where a lot of the rituals involved sex acts as part of the ritual themselves.
I wonder if that's where the Red Hot Chili Peppers album title comes from.
You know what? That's actually very well could be, actually, yeah.
It's the only other place I've heard the term sex magic before.
Right.
I mean, except for when I'm in the bedroom.
It's right. That's right.
He's a magician.
That's right. Oh, man, the bedroom, I just call it the workshop. You know what I mean? For the young people of 1967, this wasn't just revolutionary, it was validation. Suddenly, their enjoyment of life's rawest and most human experiences took on a new meaning. It wasn't just about rebellion anymore, it was about transcending the old norms to embrace something bigger and possibly better, something personal and profound. And when the Beatles placed Crowley's image on Sgt. Pepper, they weren't just nodding to a historical figure. No, they were reflecting the counterculture of the 60s, as we said. To live freely, to live authentically, do as thou wilt. Crowley's philosophy, controversial as it was, gave a generation permission to seek joy and meaning in their lives on their own terms, and for some, that made him less of a villain and more of a prophet. But boy, oh boy, if there wasn't another group of lads from Britain that were making noise around this same time, and that was the Rolling Stones. Ho ho ho! So, if the Beatles were the face of a cultural revolution, their closest rivals, the Rolling Stones, were its dark and snarling underbelly. Where the Beatles radiated charm and psychedelia, the Stones exuded a dangerous glamour. Less pop, more rock. The Stones didn't need to make subtle nods to Crowley, as they pretty much lived his lifestyle out in the open. From the start, the Stones had been cast as the Beatles' gritty counterpoint. They were dirty and aggressive and unapologetically rebellious. Their music was more than just rock and roll, it was steeped in the grit of the American blues. And while the Beatles were playing the lovable boys next door, the Stones played the role of the bad boys, the boys Mama didn't want you bringing home. You know what I mean? They were gonna step all over your mom's begonias.
Those Rolling Stones will tear up your garden.
They will. They'll just walk right all over it. They'll just walk all over it. Track dirt into the house. Rascals.
Rascals.
By the time Sgt. Pepper hit the shelves in June of '67, the Stones were busy making headlines of their own, and not always in a good way. That very month, 3 members of the band, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Brian Jones, found themselves in London courtrooms facing drug charges. But the Stones weren't about to let the Beatles dominate the psychedelic scene without their own response. Because by the end of '67, they had released their own trippy masterpiece, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. The album's title, a riff on the royal preface in British passports, Zero subtlety there. It may have been a clever play on words, but it also marked a significant moment in rock history. Pretty much for the first time, the Prince of Darkness himself was name-dropped on a major work of art. It wasn't a passing reference, or it wasn't saying, because obviously the devil has been mentioned in works of art countless times, but this was the first time he was kind of portrayed almost as like, cool. It was like, for the first time, a rock band, which, obviously they had been calling rock and roll the devil's music since before there was even rock and roll, as we know from part 1. And for the first time, you had a band really saying, hey, you know what? Maybe we do play the devil's music, Kind of like what Robert Johnson did. They leaned into the gimmick. They took what was being forced upon them and made it their own. They embraced it. With their Satanic Majesty's request, they weren't just playing with the counterculture, they were staking their claim as its darker and more dangerous force. While plenty of bands had dabbled in rebellion and bad boy antics and hard partying, the Stones took it all to a new and unsettling level. They were outlaws through and through. Now, to be fair, not all of this reputation was their own doing. Of course, critics and fans and hangers-on projected much of the Stones' aura onto them as much as they actually performed it, assigning them a level of depravity and mystique that the band members might not have claimed for themselves. But at the same time, the company they kept really didn't do them any favors. Their circle of friends and followers were sometimes included burnouts, bored aristocrats, and esoteric wannabes, and they only added to the band's infamy. These weren't just groupies and roadies, these were people chasing something weirder. Keith Richards painted the scene perfectly in his 2010 memoir, Life. He recalled the oddball entourage that surrounded the Stones, saying, quote, "There were a lot of pre-Raphaelites running around in velvet with scarves tied around their knees, looking for the Holy Grail, the lost court of King Arthur, UFOs and ley lines."
That's good, actually. That's pretty good.
While the Stones' inner circle basked in their outlaw glow, it was the band itself that took the heat. Every scandal, every strange story about secret occult rituals was laid at their feet, whether true or not. And they became more than musicians, they became symbols of excess, debauchery, and rebellion. But was it all deserved? Maybe not all of it. Some of their so-called depravity was purely projection, as we know, the fantasies of a generation desperate to see the Stones as something larger than life. Now, whether they earned that reputation or not, one thing was clear. The Rolling Stones were no longer just a band, they were also, like the Beatles, legends. The Stones were diving headfirst into the intellectual zeitgeist of the counterculture. And yes, in many ways, they embodied the hedonistic rock and roll lifestyle, but beneath that pseudo facade, there was a real curiosity about the strange and the unexplained. Partly fueled by drug experimentation and a hunger to push boundaries, and I'm sure also to compete with the likes of the Beatles, members of the band began to eagerly consume as much occult and esoteric literature as they could. For example, Mick Jagger. During the creation of their Satanic Majesty's request, Jagger was heavily into Taoist philosophy, specifically the Secret Garden of the Golden Flower, a text that promised a path to enlightenment through inner alchemy. The band dug into tomes of Celtic mythology and began weaving ancient mysticism into their creative process. But the real intrigue came from the darker corners of their library. Among their inspirations were American writer Charles Fort's The Book of the Damned, a catalog of bizarre and unexplained phenomenon that blurred the line between reality and the supernatural. An interesting fact, Charles Fort is where the word Fortiana comes from, which sort of means the strange and unexplained in the study of it. There was also Lewis Powell's The Morning of the Magicians, a conspiracy-loaded exploration of occultism and secret societies and hidden knowledge. Now, if their Satanic Majesty's request had hinted at a flirtation with the dark and mysterious, the Rolling Stones' next album, Beggar's Banquet, took things to a whole new level. Because at the center of this shift was the all-time classic, Sympathy for the Devil, a song so iconic it has become a defining piece of the Stones' legacy. Think about how many movies alone have used this song. The ditty actually carries with it a strange and fascinating origin story. Its roots can be traced to Mick Jagger's encounter with a Russian novel called The Master and Margarita, considered one of the greatest works of Russian fiction. It is an allegorical novel by Mikhail Bulgakov, written in 1939, but only published in the mid-60s after the author had died. The book found its way to Jagger through none other than his then-girlfriend, Marianne Faithfull, who I think just passed away, R.I.P. Faithfull, reflecting on the moment in her 1994 autobiography, described how Jagger devoured the novel in a single night, saying, quote, "He devoured it in one night and spit out sympathy for the devil," she wrote. The story of The Master and Margarita is set against a backdrop of Stalin's USSR and is a satire laced with the supernatural. Its central character is none other than Satan himself, who appears in Moscow with a posse of entities who then saw the chance for chaos and to expose hypocrisy and to toy with the lives of mortals. But as Faithfull was quick to point out, the novel wasn't about demonism or black magic. It was a deeply layered exploration of power, corruption, and human frailty, with echoes of the Faust legend and cameos by Pontius Pilate and St. Matthew. Jagger distilled this sprawling and complex novel into the 3-minute track we now know today as Sympathy for the Devil. The lyrics invite the listener to see the world through the eyes of Lucifer himself, not as a monstrous villain, but as a witness to the follies and atrocities of mankind. With its tribal rhythm and brilliant lyricism, Sympathy for the Devil has cemented the Stones' reputation as one of rock's greatest provocateurs. It wasn't just music, it was myth-making and a bold declaration that the Rolling Stones weren't afraid to play with fire. In fact, they even have a song called, doesn't it go, "Don't play with me because you play with fire"? Don't they have a song called Fire? I think it's in like the Darjeeling Limited or something. It's in a like a Wes Anderson flick. But don't play with me because you play with...
Wes Anderson using the Stones music? No.
Oh, I know, right? Same thing with like Marty Scorsese, always using them Stones. He's like the Stones. I think Gimme Shelter has probably been in like half of Martin Scorsese's catalog, which is cool. I mean, it's a great tune, and it always, I mean, the Stones and Scorsese even directed the famous Shine a Light documentary that I actually saw with my father back when it came out in the 2000s in IMAX. It was like a concert the Stones did for like Bill Clinton's birthday, and they filmed it with IMAX cameras. So it's like an IMAX. It's really cool because you're like there on stage, and Buddy Guy came out and played Champagne and Reefer with him, which was so good. That whole album's great, if just a side note there. But anyway, continuing. The original title of Sympathy for the Devil was actually The Devil Is My Name. So pretty interesting. I did not know that. And in a way, he's kind of like, in the opening of the song, he is introducing himself. He says, "Please allow me to introduce myself." Remember, that's like the first line of the whole thing is the devil is on his terms introducing himself to the listener. It's like a way of saying, let's put all what you've heard aside and let's take a little walk through history and look at all the shit you've done. And then we'll see who the real devil is. You know, it's sort of, a real, it's kind of an interesting take. It was certainly a provocative take on the devil, especially for that time. By the time the track was released in December of that year, the world had already endured one of the most violent and tumultuous periods in modern history. Between Vietnam and multiple high-profile assassinations, the song seemed to pour gasoline on a cultural fire. In the song, the devil takes center stage in the first-person narrative, like we were kind of just saying. He's not scary. He's not angry. Instead, it's almost seductive. The devil recounts his presence at history's darkest moments: the crucifixion of Christ, the Russian Revolution, the Blitzkrieg, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and then Bobby Kennedy. And the latter reference was even updated mid-production to reflect Bobby Kennedy's death in '68. As they were writing it, it happened and they updated it and included that. So the timing of its release, like I said, could not have been more culturally charged. It was it was a very provocative moment. It was a provocative time in history. And wow, when you really think about it in that regard, yeah, I mean, that was a pretty big deal. If you really think about it, if you were to go back in 1968, I mean, yeah, that would have been a very provocative thing at the time.
100%.
I just went and saw A Complete Unknown with my family. Even though that's about, obviously, Bob Dylan and him going electric, it's just such a incredible time and a lot of incredible things going on in history at that time. As we were saying, the timing of the release of this album and this song could not have been more politically and culturally charged. The world was spiraling into political unrest, the civil rights battles were being waged, and the horrors of war were happening overseas, and Sympathy for the Devil was a song that kind of forced listeners to confront humanity's own capacity for evil. And while provocative and catchy as hell, the song unsettled a lot of people. But here's the thing. For all its dark allure, Mick Jagger's devilish act was just that. It was an act. As Marianne Faithfull later revealed, quote, "The only reason that the Stones were not destroyed by the ideas they toyed with is they never took them as seriously as their fans. Mick never, for a moment, believed he was Lucifer." So, like we talked about in the last episode with pro wrestling, they're leaning into the gimmick, and part of that is how a legend is built. It's part of it's real, part of it's built up by fans, the mystique. It's all part of the show. Now, while the band might not have taken all that stuff too seriously, plenty of their listeners sure did. Some even saw it as more than just rock and roll. To them, what the Stones were doing was not just a performance, it was actually a ritual. It was a summons, a declaration, a window into something more unexplainable. Sympathy for the Devil did not just flirt with the occult, it was almost a ritual in and of itself.
Which really shows that they achieved what they were trying to do, that people actually took it so seriously, that they bought into it so much.
Exactly. So the band's connection to the dark and esoteric ran even deeper thanks in no small part to Keith Richards and his longtime partner, Anita Pallenberg. A beautiful German model, Pallenberg wasn't just caught up in the whirlwind of drugs and debauchery and chaos that surrounded the Stones, but many began to believe she was a large part of the band's dark aura. Maybe she was up to something sinister. Whispers of Pallenberg dabbling in witchcraft began to surface, and Marianne Faithfull did not shy away from feeding that speculation. Faithfull would go on to say, quote, "Anita eventually took the goddess business one step further into witchcraft. There were moments, especially after Brian died, where she went a little mad." And for reference, they are talking about Brian Jones, who was an original member of the band. So, now Marianne Faithfull, when talking about Jagger, was okay saying, well, he was leaning into the gimmick, but with Anita, she's saying, no, she was the legit, she was the real deal. So there was some of that circling the Stones. As we said, a lot of the people that were in their posse kind of really were more into the shit. They were actually in it. You might not have been Catholic, but you're hanging out with priests all day. It became hard to ignore how the pieces fit together. Pallenberg's reputation grew more infamous with her involvement in the 1970 film Performance, a movie so drenched in decadence and debauchery that it seemed to blur the lines not just between art and smut, but between fiction and reality. This film starred Mick Jagger as a reclusive, drug-addled rock star. His character swaps identities with a London gangster, but it was what happens off-screen that really stoked the fires of the Stones' occult legend. For Keith Richards, the film's director, Donald Cammell, was nothing short of a menace, calling him, quote, "a twister and a manipulator whose only real love in life was fucking other people up." That is what Keith Richards said about this film's director. So, apparently not a cool dude, or at least a very suspicious. Keep your eye on that guy, is what Keith's saying.
Definitely suspicious.
But Pallenberg, she seemed to thrive in the chaos. The film featured her in explicit nude scenes with Jagger and another actress named Michelle Breton, who formed the third member of their on-screen and some speculated off-screen threesome. The atmosphere on set was not just steamy, but twisted, a swirling storm of jealousy, lust, and excess. Sort of like the Creep Street podcast.
Very much.
I know, right? Creep Street podcast is nothing but a lust in excess, folks. If you want to know what goes on behind the scenes, whoo, boy, gosh, I need to take a break. Now, whether Pallenberger truly considered herself a sorceress or not, her presence, along with the drug-fueled decadence that permeated the band's world, it made rumors feel not just plausible, but almost inevitable. For fans and critics alike, it didn't matter whether she was actually a witch or not. In the murky world of the Rolling Stones, where not a single line was left unblurred, the truth was almost besides the point. At the center of this chaotic web was one of the most infamous figures in the underground cinema scene, a guy named Kenneth Anger, who by the late 60s, Anger had made his way to London, bringing a mystique and controversy along with him. A former Hollywood child actor turned provocateur, Anger had shocked the world with his vitriolic tell-all book, Hollywood Babylon, that shed light on the ugly underbelly of Tinseltown. But what truly defined Anger, Kenneth Anger that is, was his devotion to Aleister Crowley and the dark arts. Anger was a self-described warlock, and his films, like the inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, Scorpio Rising, and Fireworks, were like fever dreams of occult symbolism and sadomasochism and even homoerotic imagery. God, can't beat a title like Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome.
I mean, how do you not want to go see that?
That is a title.
Inauguration. Welcome to the Pleasure Dome.
The weirdest word in all of that is inauguration.
Yeah.
It's like, that's the weirdest thing. It's like, I get why, he's a provocateur, why you might call something the Pleasure Dome, but the inauguration. Now, through his connections with gallery owner and socialite Robert Fraser, Anger was able to meet the Stones, and he offered them a bold proposition. He wanted them to star in his latest occult film, Lucifer Rising. To Anger, this wasn't just a movie, it was going to be a ritual in itself, a work of cinematic sorcery meant to invoke the forces of darkness. And who better to embody these roles than the biggest, baddest rock band in the world? The guys who wrote Sympathy for the Devil. And Anger would say, quote, all the roles were to be carefully cast, with Mick being Lucifer and Keith as Beelzebub. But Anger's interest in the Stones went beyond their star power. He saw something deeper and something darker within their ranks. He often referred to Keith Richards, Anita Pallenberg, and Brian Jones as the band's, quote, occult unit. And Brian Jones, at least according to Anger, wasn't just dabbling in witchcraft, he was a full initiate. Anger even claimed that Jones showed him a so-called witch's tit, which is a mark historically associated in witch folklore, which I think we covered on our Salem episode.
You got witch flashed.
Yeah, come on. Anger managed to convince Mick Jagger into recording a synthesizer soundtrack for his short film Invocation of My Demon Brother, but his true goal was to bring Lucifer Rising to life using the Stones not just as actors, but as symbols. Whether the Stones fully understood what they were getting into or not, their collaboration with Anger only cemented their reputation as rock's darkest artists. But in reality, as we said, the band actually didn't take Anger that seriously, and they kind of saw him as a hanger-on. In fact, Marianne Faithfull would say, quote, Kenneth Anger they thought laughable. Mick and Keith were utterly contemptuous of his satanic hocus-pocus. So they kind of didn't even take the guy that seriously. And then there came to the back-to-back tragedies of the death of members Brian Jones and the horrific murder at Altamont. Altamont was meant to be the Woodstock of the West Coast, held at Altamont Speedway. The notorious Hells Angels biker gang were hired to be security for this event. Big mistake. Instead, they were the greatest threat there. Concert goer Meredith Hunter was stabbed to death by the gang right in the front row as the Stones played Under My Thumb. After the tragedy at Altamont, the Stones seemed to shed much of their reckless persona that had defined their earlier years. By the time they reemerged in 1972 for their next major public appearance, the Stones had traded their countercultural mystique for something sleeker and more detached, more jet set, more material. Gone were the days as young fans saw them as instruments of the revolution. Now the Stones were more like rock and roll royalty, removed from the grassroots chaos that once fueled their dangerous persona. So they now were more just kind of like bona fide rock stars, detached from the pulse of counterculture, essentially.
Yeah, I don't blame them for distancing themselves after an event like that, so they decided, hey, we need security for this thing. Let's get a gang?
Yeah, I don't know what the hell they were thinking. That story is a whole story all its own. Hunter S. Thompson, traveled with the Hells Angels for a while and wrote a book on them. But yeah, they were like a biker gang.
Let's get the Bloods and the Crips to do security for this West Coast hip-hop show.
Yeah, it's literally yeah, exactly. Or
nothing could possibly go wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's like, why?
Maybe the Hells Angels maybe they weren't seen the way they are seen now at the time.
Right.
Who knows?
Who knows? Why someone thought that was a good idea. But to wrap up volume 2 of our exploration of rock and roll and the occult, so by 1972, when the band had re-emerged as rock stars rather than these sort of occult provocateurs, other bands had picked up that torch and were spreading the occult message louder and wider than ever before. Bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin were delivering the darkness with a new intensity called heavy metal. And that is where we're going to wrap up Volume 2 of Rock and Roll and the Occult, Beatles or Stones. That's right, folks. Part 3, the last part of our series, is going to dive into heavy metal, where it kind of became, you weren't metal unless you had the devil riding with you. It kind of became part of the mystique. We'll even get up to more modern day, Marilyn Manson. And
it was a prerequisite by that point. It was like you had to go to the heavy metal licensing bureau, and the first question they ask you is, how satanic are you?
Exactly. Well, I mean, the name Black Sabbath alone is literally saying our name is occult ritual.
Right.
Or something. So, I mean, yeah, it was, when we get to part 3, no longer is it hinted at or subtly suggested. No. It's slapped there right on the album cover, right there for your mama to see and hear. And so part 3 will kind of cover heavy metal up to today. Well, folks, that is going to wrap us up. Gage, thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely fascinating episode. This was one I was really looking forward to. And man, you dug up a lot of info I was totally unaware of. So I certainly appreciated it, and I think our listeners will as well.
Absolutely. So Gage, Beatles or Stones?
Oh, for me, it's the Beatles. I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily say that one is just objectively better than the other. I just kind of prefer the Beatles' music. But they're obviously both incredibly influential, to say the least.
Right. And I think, what I'm going to say is I have the same feeling, just I lean more towards the Stones, even though I obviously appreciate, I have a great, immense appreciation for both. Yeah, for whatever reason, the Stones just spoke to me more. The more kind of rootsy, kind of blues-based rock. What's interesting, when you read Mick Jagger's autobiography, when they were young, they kind of saw specifically Chicago as like the promised land for them.
Oh.
Because that's where, so if someone had visited America and gone to Chicago, that was like the coolest fucking thing in the world. Like, to them, that was so cool. Like, to them, Chicago was like where it was at because of the blues. And of course, they also loved country music. They loved, which the Stones too.
They had eclectic taste.
They really did. You also forget the Stones kind of had a bit of a honky-tonk sound as well at times. Not always,
right.
But they kind of did. I mean, one of their great songs is Honky Tonk Woman. That kind of does have a little bit of a country flair to it. It's not like obviously country, but Love and Cup and a number of these great songs, yeah, kind of had a bit more country flair. I would say Wild Horses is almost kind of a country song in a way. It's kind of like a slow, kind of a sad country song almost. Very fascinating stuff.
Yeah, in terms of the Beatles too, one thing that's always been something I've absolutely loved about the Beatles is they are a really perfect example in the musical world of the 10,000 hours rule. I mean,
Yes.
a lot of people, anybody who knows anything about the Beatles knows that in the early days, they were performing, I believe, in Hamburg, Germany, for 10 hours a day, multiple days a week, for a long, long period of time. And it's there where they became musical masters. They had mastered their instruments. And of course, their catalog of music is so diverse, so interesting, and all of the songs to me are so timeless. And that truly is a testament to the quality of the work.
Yep. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, both amazing, amazing bands. It's not that one's better than the other. It's just they're
100%.
two bands from the same era, the same country, just with two kind of branching, almost like, it's like where a storyline might have a branch where it branches off. It's kind of like, did you take the Stones path or the Beatles path? Even though obviously you can love both, but it is kind of it's almost like two philosophies. You know what I mean? Like, of music making in a way. It doesn't mean you can't appreciate both, but yeah, it is kind of like this unique microcosm, that British invasion. And let's not forget the other great bands at the time that were coming over, like
The Who.
The Who had also talked about, they kind of felt robbed because they were already kind of a thing in England at the time that the Stones and Beatles were world famous. And they kind of felt like left out. And obviously they eventually did also become world famous too, but they kind of were more, a lot of people even consider The Who, even though you wouldn't think it, as like a proto-punk band in a way. Now, if we're talking about bands that would come in the 70s, like the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, things like that, that's almost an example of taking that 10,000 hours question and kind of what was infamous about a lot of those early punk bands was a lot of times their guitars were out of tune. They would kind of where they got their sound was almost a lack of professionalism, or not professionalism, but a lack of
Polish
in a way. So it's not necessarily the 10,000 hours, but it's what we're going to see. Because I think once again, you see kind of from the late 60s, you see a split where there's heavy metal, which takes that sound even bigger, even louder. And then there's also the punk route where it's just as loud, but it's more stripped down. It's more, 3 or 4 chords, not really a lot of solos. It's more just like a pulsating, it's like stripping it, bringing it back home, bringing it back to the roots again. In a way, it's almost like bringing it back to that early Delta blues, except you're creating something new in the process. Instead of going all the way back there, you're taking your new electronic toys and you're resetting, but with those toys.
Yeah.
And so you've now got a new kind of restarted bass, but with the modern equipment. And so, you kind of had this like punk resurgence, this back to 3 or 4 chords. The voices weren't always pretty. The people singing, they weren't always singing in key. It was kind of a new era. And then, of course, the song Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols, the first line of the song is literally, I am an antichrist. Like, it's literally, they put it right out there for you. So we'll dive into that in part 3. But I'll tell you what, Gage, I got a list of names I wouldn't mind performing an occult ritual with.
Oh yeah, who's that?
Folks, give it on up for our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Via Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the Oh-So-Suave Sean Richardson, the British Bone Breaker Bex Gray, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Vieren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist. All right, folks. Of course, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We just started a brand new TikTok, and I'm kind of getting used to it. Posted some stuff over there. It's just at Creep Street Podcast on TikTok. I think there's a link to it in our Instagram. And of course, if you want more than what you're already getting, head on over to patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast. We're going to have a lot of fun stuff this month. I've already put up an episode of the Moonset Gazette, which is something that all tiers get, whether it's 2, 5, or 10. Essentially, just so you know what it is, we're essentially building out the lore of Moonset and Creep Street and the characters. And the Moonset Gazette, it's sort of like the town's paper. And we sort of build out the lore. And everything we record, I'm going to try and do about 2 articles a month for the Moonset Gazette. They'll be on the Patreon. And then when the month rolls over, I'll put those on the YouTube so we can kind of build out our YouTube and stuff. But yeah, a lot of fun stuff happening. Gage, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, man. Always fun to tackle these fascinating topics, especially for me in the musical history genre.
Yes, absolutely. Because, obviously we're focusing on the occult and rock and roll, but really it's just a history of music in a way, but it's just a different way of looking at musical history. And that's what I've always said. Part of why I love Creep Street is it's a great history lesson. Even if we're talking about something that may only be legendary or that may or may not have happened, if it's unsure if it happened, or something you might not be able to prove happened, like maybe a haunting from centuries ago, but you're also getting a history lesson with it in a way.
Absolutely. Very true.
And of course, I love the supernatural stuff, but I'm also a history buff, and that's why I love researching these topics and everything. And so I cannot wait to wrap it up. I think part 3 will probably be our biggest episode of the series. So
awesome.
Get ready for that, folks.
Got a lot to cover.
That's right. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Good night and goodbye.